Welcome back to our series on the global financial crisis. In part 1, we looked at how a government agenda, deregulation and central bank monetary policy helped inflate the subprime mortgage bubble that was the catalyst to the global financial crisis of 2008. If you haven't already seen part 1, click the link in the top right to go watch that now. In this video, we'll dive into how these toxic subprime loans infected Wall Street and the global financial system, leading to the eventual downfall of the world economy. Hi guys, Joe here from Money Talks, and today we're going to look at how banks caused the global financial crisis. In the previous video, we mentioned how mortgage lenders were handing out loans left, right and centre, which they knew borrowers wouldn't be able to repay. This sounds counterintuitive. Why would I lend you money if I didn't think you'd be able to pay me back? The answer is securitization. Bear with me on this, it gets a little bit complicated. Securitization involves packaging up a bunch of loans, in this case mortgages, into a security which can then be sold to investors. For mortgage brokers, it didn't really matter if the borrower could afford to pay back the loan, since they immediately sold all their loans to banks and collected a healthy fee.
If I write a loan on Friday afternoon, big bank is going to buy it by Monday lunch.
Yeah, same here.
All they needed to do was entice more and more people to take out their loans, and this is why credit standards deteriorated so quickly. In order to sell them to investors, banks split mortgage-backed securities into tranches that were then given a rating by a ratings agency like Moody's, Fitch, or Standard & Poor's. The highest tranche was called the senior tranche. Think of this like the penthouse apartment with sweeping views, a roof terrace, floor-to-ceiling windows, jacuzzi, open-plan living room. Wow, I feel poor. This was typically rated AAA, the highest possible rating and therefore the lowest risk. The mezzanine tranche was next, typically rated AA+ to BB, followed by the equity tranche, which was typically either B or unrated, and therefore the highest risk. Think of these like the basement flats with concrete floors and no natural light. You gamers out there know what I'm talking about. Banks would collect the mortgage payments from the pool of loans and pay this out to each tranche as a fixed coupon rate determined by its level of risk, with the senior tranche getting paid first and the equity tranche getting paid last. But what makes one tranche more or less risky than another? As we've already mentioned, the reason lower tranches are riskier is because they are the first to not get paid if mortgages default. Imagine our block of flats gets flooded. The lower floors are the first to get hit, while the higher floors remain dry. The higher the flood rises, the more floors are wiped out. Similarly, the higher the default rate rises, the more tranches are wiped out. In that sense, lower tranches act as a buffer to higher tranches, making the higher tranches lower risk. At this point, guys, the word tranche is starting to sound made up. Yeah, I'm going to stop saying it now. Now, securitization was heralded as one of the best financial innovations in recent history. And indeed, what we've described sounds relatively safe, right? It allowed lower income people to get on the housing ladder, allowed banks and brokers to monetize illiquid capital tied up in mortgages and transfer risk to third parties. It allowed investors to get exposure to the housing market, an asset that was previously difficult to invest in directly, and provided investors with a very attractive return for taking on the risk. But this is where things start to get dodgy. Banks were typically unable to sell the lowest equity tranche of each mortgage-backed security since it was unrated and very high risk. So they started bundling these bottom tranches from different mortgage-backed securities together into a new security called a collateralized debt obligation. The CDO was then split into tranches, again with a senior, mezzanine and equity tranche, and each was given a rating. Incredibly, rating agencies, who relied on the fees from banks and so were incentivized to give higher ratings to keep their market share, gave these senior CDO tranches AAA ratings, despite them being made up almost entirely of BBB rated mortgage-backed security tranches. To put this into context, at the time this video was made, US government debt, which is basically risk-free, is rated AA+ by Standard & Poor's, meaning in theory, the US government is more likely to default than a CDO tranche made up entirely of BBB rated mortgage-backed security equity tranches with huge exposure to subprime loans that could never conceivably be paid back. I can't even begin to say how crazy this is. Surely no one would buy this, right? And yet investors around the world couldn't get enough of it. Institutional investors from pension funds to sovereign wealth funds loaded up, oblivious to what would happen next. No one, apart from Michael Berry and a few others, thought to look through these huge prospectuses of mortgages. They simply took the ratings as gospel. Even the banks who were making these securities held on to some of the tranches. Most people didn't see the real risk underlying these complex securities, and many of those who did couldn't resist the outsized returns. The innovation that was meant to increase the stability of financial markets actually meant that the fate of the entire global financial system hinged on whether or not a small number of low-income homeowners defaulted on their outsized subprime mortgages. When the tidal wave of subprime homeowners inevitably began to default in 2007, these securities were wiped out and the global financial system collapsed. That concludes our video on how banks caused the global financial crisis. In part 3, the final installment in this series, we'll take a look at how an ideological failure allowed all this to happen in the first place and discuss some ways we can prevent future financial crises. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss part 3. Thanks for watching and have a great day.